And then when Richard got involved, I remember my wife and I were taking a walk down the Katy Trail. It was a beautiful day, and I got a call from you, and I'm like, oh God, here it is. Here's Scott. He's going to put me to work. And you told me that Richard decided to get involved with this, and I'm like, that's great. The guy with the hair.
There's an epidemic in America's criminal justice system. The prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to the American Justice Podcast. Your hosts, Scott Poggensee and C. Derick Miller, come together to bring you the inside scoop on all of the wrongful conviction stories, both new and old. It's not only about the innocent who have been in prison, but also the victims of crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here are your hosts, Scott Poggensee and C. Derick Miller.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the American Justice Podcast. We have a very special episode today. We are going to be talking about Brandon Woodruff, the subject of our first season of the American Justice.
All the way back to the beginning.
We're going back to the origin. Is this our origin story?
I guess it is. You know, remember we recorded that very first episode, and we're like, wow, this is so good. This is going to be great. It's going to be so fun. And then the whole country went into lockdown.
And then the whole world took a crap.
After episode 1. And we're like, well, what do we do now? And so we wearing masks and doing Q&A episodes, and we both shaved our heads. And
yep. But we pivoted well. We did some Zoom calls and stuff like that. But yeah, that was pretty scary for a while. Well, today we're going to be we are joined by a very special guest, Mr. Richard Ray, formerly of Fox 4 News for 40 plus years.
Well, 36 for Fox 4, 46 in TV News.
46 in TV News, yes. So a legend here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex.
I grew up watching him. I wasn't a news guy, but I never cared about the news up until 2016, and now it's all I can do to watch it. But I remember being a teenager, and of course living with my grandparents, and they watched the news religiously, and I remember watching this guy like daily.
Yeah.
Daily.
Oh yeah.
And my only thought, because I was before now, of course it looks like somebody pulled up right on top of my head and peeled out, and I got kind of a spot missing. But I used to be a hair guy. I used to be really obsessed with my hair. I had really long hair, beautiful, washed, conditioned, brushed, just like a lion's mane. Gorgeous. I mean, it was the mullet days.
Right.
And I was like, man, that guy has great hair. That's what I took from his 36 years on Fox. That guy's got great hair.
That is a comment that I hear about him often. Look at that hair.
Accused of having good hair.
Well,
my origin story with this show has a little bit to do that too. In fact, let's start on this because I had no idea about any of this until after I retired and I was working in the film industry, still working in the film industry some, and I got a message on Backstage from a guy with a long, strange name that wanted some help in doing a reenactment, and he asked if I would be interested in doing a part, and I wrote him back. I didn't think I was interested in doing that part. I wrote him back, said thanks, but no thanks. And then I get an email from him, and he says, oh, my God, it's the Richard Ray. Apparently, Scott as well had been a viewer for years.
Oh, yeah.
So we started talking about it, and then I saw the rough cut documentary that Scott had done. Mm-hmm. And I mean, from like the first 30 seconds of it, I'm going, man, this has got stuff. And this has got potential to be making of a murderer kind of docuseries. I mean, that was my immediate thought. And then as I talked to Scott more and more, I think he'd come to that same conclusion that there's so many twists and turns to the Brandon Dale Woodruff story that to really do it justice, you really almost need a 4 to 6 part episodic series. So we talked about it a little bit. Scott had done all this work for years. By that time, you'd been at it for 4 years?
Yeah, about 3 or 4 years, yeah.
And I said, I know you're having some trouble getting traction on this. I've got some connections in the business, not really in the film business, but other connections. I think I can help you if you'd be willing to take me on as a partner. I would like to pour my heart and soul into this case. And And then we did. And since that time, it's been a roller coaster ride, my friends.
Yeah.
As you both know, up and down. It's kind of up again now with, I think one of the reasons we're here today is because ABC's 2020 is dropping its big story tomorrow night. So it's been a roller coaster ride, but I'm more committed now than ever. My wife and I pray about this every day. Brandon does not deserve to be in prison. Our film is going to be, the film we're working on now, like ABC's story, is going to be balanced. It's going to let the viewer decide from the evidence what they think. But
right.
I don't think it's any secret what I think.
And I think that that's always been our goal, is just to get the evidence out there and let people, know the real story, because there's so many twists and turns and different aspects of this story that not a lot of people don't know the whole story, and because there's so much to it. But I wanted to say, I wanted to give kind of a behind the scenes tidbit about when we first met. And, I had shared with you the rough cut, and you were like, yeah, this looks really good. Let's get together and talk about it. And we met and we went to lunch, and we both said when we sat down, like, well, I have to leave in like 30 minutes or an hour or whatever. We have some other obligation. And then I think it was about 2.5 hours later that we left. But it's one of those. This is just one of those stories where when you start talking about it and you start telling the story, it's like everything that you bring up brings up another point and another twist and another. Oh yeah, well let me tell you about the gun. Oh yeah, well let me tell you about the knife. There's just so many different aspects to this story, and if you guys haven't listened to season 1 yet, I would suggest that you go back and do that, because we actually cover the whole story and we go into details about each particular, like I think we had a whole episode on just the sword, and why that was not the murder weapon and all the suspicious circumstances that it was found under and stuff like that. So yeah, go back and listen to that. And then as Richard said, we're here to talk about the fact that ABC, the network television, ABC News, is doing a story on 2020 tonight about Brandon Woodruff. And, we've known about it. They've been in town. I think they've been actually filming interviews since sometime in February, late February, early March. So they've been at it for a while. And they interviewed all kinds of people that we don't even know about. So it'll be, it'll be kind of a surprise for all of us to see what the show looks like, just like it will for all the viewers. But yeah, that's exciting, and it's just another one of those things about Brandon's case that and a lot of people don't know about this yet. But we were actually contacted by another network show. It was Hillary Burton's show called "It Couldn't Happen Here." And so they're going to be in town at the end of this month filming with us as well. But when I was talking to that producer, he was like, I don't understand why every network and every show is not covering this story. It's just so fascinating.
Well, and I think that what is important about that, too, is when they contacted us, they said right out of the box, we're not going to demand any exclusivity. And at that point, we thought 2020 was going to air it. We knew they'd been in town shooting for 6 weeks or 2 months. But there's never a guarantee until it's on TV.
Right.
And so, and they take a different tact in their story.
Yeah.
It's very personality driven, sort of her personality, having grown up in a small town. And I know, Scott, you and I both watched the first 3 or 4 that they did, and they're very, very well done. But it's done in a different way than the ABC's 2020 show is likely to be done. But it gets the story out there. Chad, I think you know this too, but Scott and I, over the last year and a half or year plus at least, have been contacted by a number of different organizations. We were working with a production company out of Pennsylvania early on that was excited about it, wanted to pitch the story to Netflix and Amazon Prime and the streaming services. And when they found out that another one of the big 4 network programs was talking to us, they were like, Well, no, don't work with them, because if they do the story, well, then Netflix or anybody else is going to look at it and say, no, that story's been done. They're not going to do it. Well, Scott and I both immediately said, no, first of all, we don't believe that's true.
Right.
And second of all, we've got to put what's best for Brandon first. Whatever film or docuseries comes out of this has got to come second to that. So we've been open to all comers, and several made a run at it. 2020 is doing it. Another one is going to do it, I think, later this year.
Yeah.
Is what they told us, maybe
November,
or
December, yeah.
something like that. So the more the story gets out there, even 17 years too late, the more story gets out there, the better chance I think we have of putting pressure on the right people to do the right thing. And somebody else committed these murders, and other people know who committed these murders, and there's always the chance, praise God, that somebody would come forward and say, I can't live with this any longer. And that would make it a lot simpler, but we'll see.
I think that would make it a lot simpler. And all of these wrongful convictions, if the guilty person would just come forward and say, I did it. And a lot of times, and we talk about this in a lot in season 3 of the podcast, is that a lot of times somebody will come forward and they'll confess, and it still is not enough to get the person out of prison. And it's just like, sometimes you sit there and think to yourself, like, what does it take to get this guy who's obviously innocent out of prison? And that's another one of those points that I always tell people is, a lot of people will say, oh, well, Brandon's had, all of his appeals and they were all denied, so that must mean that he's guilty. And in a vast majority of exonerations that, finally get the person out by DNA or whatever, a vast majority of them, those people had all of their appeals denied as well. So it's not just, the judicial system, especially in the appellate process, is not geared towards fairness. It's not geared towards truth. It's not geared towards, looking at it in the light favor to the defendant. It's all, in fact, they even put this in most of their decisions, is we have to look at the verdict in the light most favorable to the prosecution and favorable to the verdict. And that's something that needs to change, because I think it's been proven over and over and over that, with all these exonerations, that the police don't always get it right, and the prosecution doesn't always get it right. And, sometimes there's prosecutorial misconduct, and sometimes there's, eyewitness fallibility or whatever. But, just because someone is convicted does not, and especially when it's someone like Brandon, where they're like, screaming their innocence from the treetops, like, you have to take pause and kind of listen to that and be like, wait a second, maybe we should take a look at this. Because there's a lot of people that are convicted that they just kind of accepted. Yeah, I did it, and I'm doing my time. But when somebody is so fervent and so adamant about their innocence, I think it deserves a second look.
I never thought in a million years that 17 years later I'd be sitting here with you guys doing this thing, because
the way you got involved was really crazy.
I met Brandon the night he was arrested. I was working for the Hunt County Sheriff's Department as a jailer at the time, just a jailer, and everyone was talking it up. Everyone was Brandon Woodruff. I was coming in the door for my shift. Brandon Woodruff. Oh, right in there, right inside that tank. There's a killer in there. Brandon Woodruff. So I was still kind of new to that job. So I, with a little bit of hesitation, went over there to just have a look and see, because they had him like in solitary in the intake area at the time. And what I saw was not a killer. I was like, he just looked so just timid and out of place in here. There was nothing in his eyes that screamed guilt or violence or anything.
Right.
And even in your film, the scene where I believe it's CBS out of Dallas that's interviewing him inside the jail, I'm right outside that door.
Yeah.
I drew the short straw and I had to guard the door. But I was promoted into a classification position where I handled all the disciplinary, I handled all the grievances, I worked within the system, comparing criminal histories to see who would fit together in what areas for for the most harmony inside of an environment such as that.
Right.
And I got to see Brandon a lot. I interacted with Brandon quite a bit because there were always grievances, as far as Brandon was concerned, how he was being treated by some of the employees there, or how he was being treated in some of the other inmates. Because, I mean, let's face it, the guy was in there accused of murder. So he's in there with the worst of the worst. Mm-hmm. And being as timid and as submissive as he was compared to some of those monsters, you can imagine some of the stories I heard and some of the grievances I read. So I was talking to Brandon on pretty much a daily basis there for a couple of years. And even when there wasn't something going on with a grievance or a problem, I would still just go down there and talk to him, because he was by far one of the most intelligent inmates that I ever had conversations with in my history with the Hunt County Sheriff's Department. Well, then I completely lost track of him. I moved up into another position out of the jail and completely lost track. And after he was sentenced and sent to the penitentiary, I mean, to be quite honest, I didn't even think, his name didn't even cross my mind for such a long time. And I had a lot of changes going on in my life.
Right.
And it just so happened that I went through a divorce, and my lawyer and friend was also Brandon's defense attorney. It's Catherine Ferguson.
Catherine Ferguson.
And
the great Catherine Ferguson.
Amazing, wonderful, beautiful Catherine Ferguson. She's so awesome. I miss her so much. She asked me what I thought about the Brandon Woodruff case, and I'm like, oh my God, that's a name that I haven't heard now in years, because I left the Hunt County Sheriff's Department completely in 2013. And I'm like, I don't know. He's the only person that I thought didn't do it. Of all, no matter who it was or what they were accused of in the Hunt County Jail between the years 2004 and 2013, he was the only one I thought didn't do what they said he did. Yeah. And she's like, well, there's a documentary film about him that's going to be premiered at the Texas Theater in Oak Cliff in Dallas next week, and I think you ought to be there. And I'm like, well, ironically, I was working for the Herald Banner at the time, doing freelance journalism, arts and entertainment.
Yeah.
And I'd already been tasked with going to see that, not being judgmental about the film really, but just going and reviewing, not forming an opinion on the case.
Your Stories on Video is the perfect service to preserve all of your memories for generations to come. If you've ever thought to yourself that it's time to get all of those precious memories down on video, now is the time. Here's a quick sample of one of our videos.
My name is Daryl Kaiser, and I was born in 1925 in Canby, Minnesota. The happiest day of my life. It has to be when I got married. Yeah, that would have to be my happiest day. I sat down in a chair that was several chairs, and there was women on the opposite side. And I ordered me a drink, and I looked down that way, and Betty was looking at me. So I winked at her. And the next thing I know, then I went and asked her for a dance, and we danced and several times, and then I asked to take her home. I can't say that I ever gets out of my mind at all.
Daryl hired Your Stories on Video because he wants his grandkids and their grandkids to hear from his own mouth and his own likeness what his life was like. He also shared the family ancestry as only he could. Going back and researching archives are one thing, but watching the person that lived it is so much better. The process to get a video is very simple. Just go to www.yourstoriesonvideo.com and request a consultation. Then one of our experienced story consultants will work with you from the beginning to the end to make sure your video is exactly what you want it to be. Many kinds of individuals and families utilize our service, from the older generation wanting to pass down their wisdom to those that have an unfortunate medical diagnosis. Contact Your Stories on Video today at yourstoriesonvideo.com. Mention the American Justice Podcast and receive a 25% discount.
This case got lost in the shuffle from the beginning because Greenville's just far enough outside of Dallas that it doesn't routinely get a lot of coverage from the Dallas-Fort Worth media. And Katrina had just happened, Hurricane Katrina. So Dallas was being flooded by refugees. That was a big story. Reporters were being sent to New Orleans to cover the aftermath of that. And this gruesome double murder just didn't really get any coverage until 2.5 years later, when it was discovered that they had been illegally listening to Brandon's conversations with his legal team. And from what I can see of the paperwork, it looked like the judge was going to maybe just kind of ignore that.
Yeah.
But then a front page story on the Metro section of the Dallas Morning News comes out with, caught listening to his lawyer's conversations, and that's such a egregious violation of his of his constitutional rights that myself and other reporters were sent to Greenville to cover that part of the story. So that's the one part of the story that I did cover when it was happening, was this, can you believe it? They were actually listening to his calls. And then as you get deeper into it, as I've said many times, the deeper I get into this, the more angry it makes me. They weren't only listening to his calls, they had 41 pages of notes on those.
Yep.
And yet still the judge called in an outside judge. The outside judge says, yeah, they didn't really find anything. So we don't know what they found by listening to that. That's still not been exposed, which it should have been at the time. And then, Scott, you know this part of the story better than I do, the legal part of it, where in some appellate districts, that's an immediate throw it out, start all over.
Right.
But it's not here.
Right.
So the hope was that if it went to the Supreme Court, that they could have a ruling for all the different.
Right. There's 11 circuit courts in the United States, and some of them have the opinion that you have to show that you were harmed, and then it'll be dismissed. Some of them, it's an automatic dismissal. And then some of them say that you don't even have to prove that you were harmed. You just have to prove that it was intentional. So there's all these different opinions in these circuit courts all over the United States. So that's one of the reasons that we were really hoping that the Supreme Court would take up this issue, but they ultimately did not. And I think that that's another point that we need to bring up about, appeals and the appeals process, is it doesn't, just because somebody's exhausted their appeals does not mean that they've had judges or courts at all these different levels look at the case. A lot of times, and as is in Brandon's case, only one time did they have oral arguments where they were actually able to argue the case, and that was the direct appeal, which everybody gets when they're convicted, every felony. So, the judges have to listen to that. So that's the only reason that they were there. So they listened to it, and the judges basically said, we have a lot of problems with the evidence in this case, but that's not our job to determine whether or not there's sufficient evidence, because there was some decision that came down from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals that basically said that that's not the direct appeals job, that's our job. So they ruled, well, there was no egregious errors by the judge, that there was no procedural errors, and that's all that appeal is to do. And then when they appealed it to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, they just put it on the desk and didn't look at it. And they said no, they just took it and shoved it away from them and said, no, we're not going to take a look at it. So it's not like Brandon's had his case argued, several times on several different levels. It's, he's made these appeals, and the judges or the courts or whatever basically just said, I'm going to let the lower court stand, and I'm just not going to look at it or consider it.
And at the Supreme Court level, they didn't deny it; they just didn't hear it.
Right.
So again, he didn't get a hearing.
Right, and with the Supreme Court, they only hear about 2% of the cases that are appealed there. But the problem is, like we said, that we felt like that because there were all these different decisions in the lower courts, that that's really the Supreme Court's job is to go back and review lower courts' opinions and see if there's something that that they can settle or whatever, and make it the law of the land, as they say. So, all right. So let's stop. And is it dead?
It is. I mean, it's like
Okay.
doing that.
All right. Second one.
Second one.
Yeah, because we can talk about the. I mean, we can talk about the pod.
Some of you are listening to this before you're seeing the ABC 2020. And of course, that's why we're doing this podcast today. We want to give some people some background leading into that, even if you see it after the ABC piece. I know Scott and others who are emotionally invested in this, they've been worried. I know Edie, one of Brandon's biggest supporters, called Scott today, and oh my goodness, I'm just so worried about it. Well, and a lot of people are worried, okay, are they going to make him look guilty? Well, there are going to be parts of the show that indicate, yes, there are people who think that he is guilty, and here's why they think that. Although we've had really a lot of trouble finding people that will say that.
Right.
They will say that. But keep in mind, ABC's 2020 and all these other shows that are making a run at this story are not doing it because they think he's guilty. They are clearly doing it because this is a case that screams there's really probable doubt about whether he did this. There's a lot of reasonable doubt. Did he really do it? That's the only reason they would do this case. So keep that in mind as you watch that, those of you who are as emotionally invested in it as Scott and Chad and I are.
And there's also, there's parts that, and in my discussions with the producer, and I told him this many times, I said, look, we don't have a problem with presenting the evidence in Brandon's case and putting it all out there, as long as it's the truth and as long as, there is presented, when there is a false thing, that it's presented that, what the false part of it is. For example, I saw in the promo that Dan Abrams, one of the legal analysts, said, well, Brandon presented a timeline that just wasn't truthful. And that's true, that he didn't know what time he was at certain places. The timeline part of it was the only part of it that he wasn't sure about. And he told the Rangers, I'm not sure about it. I don't know exactly. I can't give you an exact time, I think is his direct quote. And but it's important to note that he told the Ranger every place that he went that night. It's not like he said, I went to ABC and he really went to XYZ. It was, I had dinner with my parents. I went back to the Heath house. I went to, pick up Robert. I went to Alex's house. Went to and he told him all the places that he went. He just happened to be a couple hours off on his time because it was a week ago, and he had checked with other people like, hey, what time did we meet? And and they gave him a wrong time. So as long as they present the truth and they talk about why certain things are, then we won't have a problem with presenting the truth.
In fact, that timeline is really crucial to this case because I think that's when the Ranger decided Brandon did it because he's lying to me about his timeline. But
Right.
the timeline turns out to be, I think, the strongest piece of evidence that Brandon could not have done it. If the Ranger would have gone and got the phone records, if the Ranger would have done all that, not waiting 6 months to get the phone records, if he would have pieced it together, he'd know what we know now, and that is that Brandon's mother was on the phone with her mother until 9:20 or 9:30, somewhere in that part. Mm-hmm. The next door neighbor, Brandon's on the phone at 9:41 or 9:46, couple calls to his girlfriend and a friend, and the next door neighbor tells the Ranger that the 10 o'clock news had just started when he saw him in Heath.
Right.
And then again, you fast forward, his phone pings at 10:46 on his way back to Dallas-Fort Worth. So if you put that timeline together, there's simply not enough time for him to even drive from Royce City to the house in Heath, much less kill both his parents, stab and shoot them 17, 19 times, whatever, clean the whole place up spotless so nobody's DNA or any evidence is found, do all that, feed the horses, all the stuff he did in that timeline. So that the whole thing about he lied about his timeline, the deeper you get into it, the timeline proves he couldn't have done it.
Right. And he didn't, and you know, that's like, for me, that's like the example that I think of is, you know, like if you were to say, Scott, I owe you some money. How much do I owe you? And I would say, I don't know. I think it's like $20, something like that. And you look back through your receipts and say, no, it was $25. You're lying to me. You know, it's like, no, I said, I don't know. I said it, you know, and that's exactly what Brandon was doing, is he was telling the ranger over and over again, I can't give you an exact timeline. I don't remember. I know that I went, you know, left my parents' house around 7 o'clock, around 7:30, somewhere around there. You know, and then when the ranger comes back and, you know, says, oh, well, if you left at 7, then you would have gotten there at 7:30 and, you know, take care of all the animals and stuff like that. It would be about 30 minutes. And Brandon's like, yeah, I guess so. You know, most 19-year-olds are not good with time, you know, but Brandon was, by all accounts, exceptionally not good with time, you know. Like he may tell you he'll be there at 5 o'clock and you'll get a call at 5 o'clock saying he might be there at 6 or 7. You know, that type of thing is the way that he was, by all accounts.
Well, you know, speaking of the ranger, I mean, the ranger hit it right
the
on
one
the
that
head.
does it with the lights on.
Yeah, does it with the lights on. But he hit it right on the head. I mean, he even said on the stand, if I'm not mistaken, if you can lie about your homosexual lifestyle, you can lie about murdering your parents.
Right.
I know that was stated repeatedly in this case, and I worked with these people. Like I had offices in the same hallway with these investigators, the Texas Rangers, everybody. The environment up there in the Hunt County Sheriff's Department is very, I mean, for I guess, hateful. The way they discuss homosexuality, the way they discuss race. Now, you know, I can't speak 2013 until today, but I'm telling you, 2013 and prior, it was a very difficult place if you were a person of color, or if you lived what they would call an alternative lifestyle.
Right.
God, and now,
If you're any
did you see
kind
how
of-
I rolled my eyes just then when I said that?
And
I've
we
heard
talked to Sheriff Jones now, and you know, he definitely says that things have changed and progressed and stuff like that, and we have no reason not to believe him. But yeah, back then it's, you know, a different sheriff, different times, different. But
Have you talked about that on the podcast, that we did finally get an interview with Terry Jones?
we have not talked about that yet.
Well, this has been, for people who may have followed this story, one of the most difficult things about doing this documentary is that generally in a case where somebody's convicted, the prosecutors, the investigators, they're more than willing to tell you exactly why they think the guy or the gal is guilty. And they'll lay it all out. Well, he did it, and this is why we think he did it, and blah, blah, blah. We just could not get anybody involved with the prosecution, beginning with the ranger, any of the prosecutors,
Any
to talk about the
investigators,
case.
yeah.
And it wasn't until we decided that we were going to do an old-fashioned television news ambush interview with Sheriff Terry Jones, which is something you do in television news. You can't do it for a documentary necessarily, but that is, we found out that he was going to be speaking at an event in Greenville, with a Chamber of Commerce event, and we decided that we'd be in the parking lot, and when he pulled up in the pickup, we'd just go up and talk to him.
Yep.
That's a pretty interesting story. You want to share that one here?
Yeah, I mean,
Interesting story because Randy Meeks, who is the previous sheriff, really doesn't have any involvement in the case except that he had just taken office, I think, when Brandon was convicted.
That's correct, because it was Sheriff Don Anderson.
Randy and I have been, you know, phone pals for years. And when he was sheriff, if anything happened in Hunt County, I could call Randy day or night. I had a cell phone, and he'd talk to me about it. And he'd recently lost his wife, and so over the years, Randy and I'd kind of stayed in touch a little bit. And so I had called Randy because we were so desperate to find anybody, even though he doesn't know a lot about the case.
Right.
He was willing to talk to us, and I had just been talking to him on the phone by text about setting up an interview, and he had agreed to do it.
right.
And
which was a revelation to us, because that was even though he didn't have a lot of involvement, he was the only one on the prosecution investigative side that would even agree to talk to us.
Yeah. So we're having this text conversation back and forth with Randy while we're driving to ambush. It sounds bad, but that's what we call it in TV news. It's an ambush interview.
Right.
You set up somewhere where you know they're going to be. So we're on the way to the ambush interview with Terry Jones, and we're talking to the producer from 2020.
Yeah.
And we're sharing some stuff with him because Scott had helped him a lot.
Yeah.
And I get this text from Randy Meeks saying, well, I just talked to the sheriff and he doesn't want me to do it, so I'm going to have to cancel. Well,
conveniently enough, as we're about to talk to
the sheriff. So we walk up, he gets out of his pickup truck, and I was cordial, but I was frustrated. In fact, at one point, he even asked me, are you angry at me? And I said, no, I am not angry, but I am very frustrated.
And a little bit of backstory is we had been trying to contact Terry for almost a year or maybe even a year at that point. And, we would call his office, we'd leave messages, emails and
nothing.
Yeah. So that's why you were so frustrated.
Well, and then to get this text where he apparently told Randy Meeks not to talk to me. Well, in this conversation, I'm asking him, why won't anybody talk to us? And why did you tell Randy Meeks he can't talk to us? And he kind of denied it, sort of. And I said, I'll show you the text. And I showed him the text. Long story short, we were as cordial as we could be under those circumstances. The camera goes off. Mm-hmm. He goes in for a little bit, comes back out. We have another conversation in the parking lot. And I like Terry very much. I really do like Sheriff Jones. He's a good guy.
Yep.
And the conversation was, Sheriff Jones, I really would rather not have this be our only interview. Would you please just sit down and do an interview with us? I'll give you the questions in advance. We're not going to badger you. We just want you to tell us what you know about the case and why you think Brandon's guilty. That's what we need for our documentary.
Right.
Well, long story short, because it took like another month before we finally got that interview arranged. And then when we did get it arranged, it was a very interesting situation because he insisted on doing the interview in, I'm guessing, the same interview room, the same little bit larger than a
10 by 10
interview room that Brandon and Charla and all the principals in this case, because he wanted to have his own copy of the interview in case whatever came back, and
in case
which
we
is going to
decided.
make really interesting stuff for the documentary because they've at least agreed that they're going to give us their copy of the interview. We're going to give them our copy of the interview. So matching the two interviews together with that, it makes for it's not going to be the kind of interview you expect to see in a documentary. That we lit it as well as we could, but he's basically sitting in a corner with gray walls and a single electrical outlet as the only backdrop for it. But then the interview went fine afterwards. It was the after interview that was very interesting.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really encouraged me, and I think probably for both of us made us like him so much, is after the interview, we sat around and talked for probably a good 30 minutes, and we just talked about the case and a little bit. We talked about life in Greenville. We just kind of shoot the shit for a little bit, and then at the very end, he actually turned to me and said, I assume you talk to Brandon every once in a while, and I said yeah, and he said, well, how is he? How's he doing? And that kind of caught me off guard because I think that we had talked a little bit, or maybe even kind of extensively, about some of the stuff that we knew about the case that showed that Brandon was not guilty. And to be fair, Terry really wasn't involved in the investigation very much. I mean, he sat in on an interview or two. He was sent to Texarkana to arrest him. But as far as the investigation, he didn't really take part in it and wasn't really kept up to date about the whole investigation at the time because he, obviously they had other cases and stuff, and he was not the main person that was assigned to the case. So a lot of the stuff that we were telling him was new to him and that he didn't know that had happened. So I think by the end of the interview, or by the end of when we were talking to him after the interview, I think he kind of started to realize that everything's not adding up here, and that there may have been some mistakes made, and there may have been, stuff like that. So, but at the end of that, when he asked me, how Brandon was doing, it really almost like knocked me on my butt. Like I was like, whoa, that's.
And he did express repeatedly that in any case, if evidence comes forward that somebody shouldn't, that he wants that exposed. We didn't get a commitment that he would be willing to do much beyond that, but I did get the distinct impression that he was being very honest about that. He's a person who believes that in right and fairness, and if evidence comes forward, which we all hope will someday,
Right.
That he'd be more than willing to have that exposed. I don't think he's trying to hide anything. As Scott said, his involvement in the actual investigation was somewhat limited. There are others that we're still trying to talk to that I don't think we're ever going to get Ranger Collins.
Yeah.
Not going to happen. But there's another interview or two with people who were more heavily involved that could shed some light.
Right, and that's all we want to do is just, as we told Terry, and I think that we honored our word, is we just want to get your perspective. We're not walking into the interview trying to, ambush him or trying to do any kind of gotcha interview where we just stand up and say, you knew he was innocent or anything like that. We just really wanted to know where their head was, what evidence was coming to light, what made them believe that he was the one that did it. And I think we treated him real fairly, and he hopefully is telling everyone else that we treated him fairly, and maybe we can talk to these other people under the same circumstances. We just want to know what was going on in your head when.
In fact, I've even used that in one other key interview we're trying to get. I said, please talk to Terry Jones, I know he's a friend of yours. Please ask him if we treated him fairly. And he said he would, so we'll see.
Yeah, and we won't say who that is right now out of respect to him, but maybe someday we can describe a wonderful interview with him as we did with Terry.
Yeah, and I've known Terry Jones since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
I mean, growing up in Greenville, everybody knows everybody. Terry was a teenager when I first met him. I mean, Terry was a wild child. He ran around with my uncle. My uncle was a wild child. And then, people change. We all do. And he got involved in law enforcement, and he worked his way up through the ranks, and he is now the sheriff. And those usually make the best types of elected officials, are those people who work their way up through the ranks,
right,
and became who they are. Whereas you've got the last two sheriffs of Hunt County. I mean, granted, Don Anderson, who was sheriff during the Brandon Woodruff case and Brandon Woodruff trial, was a lifer. He's in the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame in Waco.
Yeah.
And then Randy
Did they
Meeks.
turn the lights on there yet?
I don't know. Last time I drove by there, I couldn't tell if the lights were on or not. I think they were off.
Okay. Probably.
I got to go back to Austin here pretty soon. I'll pay closer attention when I go back.
And just to let people know, the reason that I think that's the second time we joked about that, but the original crime scene video that they did it in the dark, just walking around, stumbling over stuff and pointing flashlights and trying to get stuff on video. But they did it in the dark because the ranger suggested that they do it in the dark because they wanted the jury to see it the way that they first saw it. So it's kind of a running joke that the Rangers do it with the lights off.
You people, you have what, about 28 hours, or I guess when this will air, you have a good 8 or so hours to go back and listen to some of the first season of the American Justice podcast.
Yeah.
I had someone this morning. I shared Richard's post on social media with the video for the commercial for the 2020 episode.
Right.
And one of my old friends was like, details? And I'm like, yeah, it's called the American Justice Podcast Season 1. I've been talking about it nonstop for 2 years.
Right.
Just press play, baby. It's free.
Well, and I think that's what, getting back to the reason that we're here for this podcast is that when ABC, someone like ABC, a national news magazine or a national outlet, airs something like this, it almost gives it I wouldn't say legitimacy, but it definitely gives it that air of this is an important story. This is something that people need to hear about, because these people are suggested stories all the time. And and what's interesting about this is we didn't even write ABC. They called us and they were like, "Wait a second, we heard about this case. I started to look at it a little bit. Can you tell me more information of it?" And the producer, when we first talked on the phone, I mean, we talked for probably about 2 hours, and just because it's one of those things, again, where you start talking about this case, there's so many twists and turns that you kind of have to back up and give a little bit of background on what you're about to say. It's like, I'm about to talk about the knife, but let me tell you a little bit about that knife first before I tell you what I was going to tell you. So that ends up making long conversations, and the producer was just so fascinated. He kept apologizing for taking my time, and I'm like, wait a second, you're a big time New York producer. Like, I'm kind of feeling bad about taking your time. And he was like, no, I'm so interested in this case. And so that's what I think that gives us the and Richard, you mentioned earlier that we are kind of nervous about how it's gonna play out, but we, as long as they tell the truth, that's all that we care about.
The best possible outcome is that it becomes part of the national discussion, not just a small core group of people who've been crying in the wilderness for 17 years that Brandon's innocent, but other people with power and influence get interested in the story. I mean, how many stories have been really moved forward because the right celebrity or the right politician or the right public person decided, wait a minute, this kid didn't get a fair trial. Mm-hmm. I'm going to get behind it. So we're hoping that kind of thing comes out of this, that it gets a wider discussion. And I'm going to share something. I've been a little bit disappointed that the local community has not rallied behind Brandon more. And when I say community, the LGBTQ community. I mean, it's David at Lambda Radio has been awesome in trying to get it out there, but I haven't seen there needs to be. I mean, if any community is going to rally behind this guy, that should be the first one.
Right.
And I'm a little surprised there hasn't been more of that.
Well, and I think it's for two reasons, and I've always said that our community needs to rally around him, because if it can happen to Brandon, it can happen to them. If somebody's going to demonize this coming out process that is a normal process for every gay person out there, then who knows what the police can accuse you of. And then all they have to do is stand up and say, well, if you can lie about being gay, then you can lie about rape, murder, robbery, whatever the crime is. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think that because this case is so complicated and there's so many twists and turns, that you really have to, like when we first met, I showed you the rough cut of the documentary, and then even after that, we ended up having a 2.5 hour conversation just to even really get the basics. And you've admitted that pretty much all the time since then, something else comes up, and there's another thing that you had never heard about, and another thing that you had never heard about, and then I'll just write you out of the blue and say, oh, by the way, did you hear about this? And you're like, no, I had no idea about that. And
it's strange coincidences, because at one point I'm hearing about this interview that one of the kids that Brandon went out with that night happens to be the son of close church friends of ours.
Right.
And I'm going, wait a minute, that can't be
his dad,
Alex. It was.
Yeah.
So it has been. I'm getting goosebumps here, because there were so many times like that where I thought, okay, there can't be any more bizarre twists and turns to this. But here I am, and Alex has since died.
Yeah.
And it's just, it does. That's why we think a docuseries is the only way to tell this.
Right.
Okay, the one thing about the origins that we haven't discussed is how the podcast got started. How did you, I know you guys met at one of the first screenings.
Right.
But how did the podcast come about?
Well, after all of the the screenings, we always do a Q&A. And because there's, after the hour and a half or 2 hour screening, there's usually about an hour and a half or 2 hours of questions. And one person said during the question and answer, they said, you should do a podcast about this case. And I was like, well, that's a good idea because I think we can go into the depth that the case deserves. But I can't imagine just ramping up and doing a whole podcast just about one case, So then Chad and I were talking and we were like, well, wait a second. What if we did it about other people, in subsequent seasons that we believe are innocent? And so that's kind of how that, and I was like, okay, we can do that. We'll do the first season about Brandon. And then, we'll find somebody, a viewer or somebody will give us an idea about a second season. And we ended up doing the Vincent Cosi case in the second season. And then Chad and I kind of had a conversation that was like, there's so many cases out there. There's so many wrongful convictions that maybe we should kind of pivot a little bit and talk about those cases. So that's what season 3 is about. Each week we have a different case. And it's been very well received. We're doing a lot better than we expected in our, podcast. You don't have ratings, you have downloads. So our downloads are going up and up and up. And but yeah, that was how it originally came about. Was like we need to have a place where we can just talk about this case, explain every detail about it. Because, and I always tell people, we're making an hour and 47-minute rough cut about the film, and it talks about a lot of the stuff. But if you really want to know the details about every aspect of this case, you have to listen to the podcast. And that's, and that was the format that gave us that. So if anybody is truly interested in the case and the details of the case, then that is the way to get it. You're not going to get it from an ABC 2020, 2-hour show that only has 80 minutes minus commercials. You're not going to get it even from, you may get it from a 6-part docuseries if and when we ever get that developed. But, as far as right now, the only thing that's available, if anybody wants to know about all the details of this case, is the first season of The American Justice.
And it's a deep dive. It is such a deep dive. It was all I lived that for forever getting that first season ready.
I mean, we have 2 episodes just on Mike Etherington's interview.
Right. I did that expose.
Yeah.
I remember going out and like having breakfast with my son in Greenville, and members of the Hunt County Sheriff's Department pulling me aside and telling me that I was being spoken about at the sheriff's office when I was working on that expose. Coming home from work and finding strange cars in my driveway that would drive away the minute that I would get home. That's when I decided to move to Dallas. I was dating a girl here, and we eventually got married, and she had just bought a place, and she's like, "You want to move in with me?" Yes, please.
Yes, please.
You
mean move out of Greenville? Yes, please.
And if there's anybody out there listening, especially in the LGBTQ community, I have a full-blown expose that was asked for by 2 different entities in the media and then never printed.
Right.
So if anybody out there wants it to print and use, I don't want any money out of it. I don't want anything out of it at all. I want exposure. I want Brandon to be set free.
Right.
That is what I want. I had a dream the other night. It's strange and ironic that this is all going on.
I have a dream.
It's one of those Wizard of Oz dreams,
someday.
And you were there, and you were there, and you were there. I did have a dream the other night where I was having a barbecue at my place, and we were all there, and Brandon was there.
Nice.
So, I'm not a psychic, but
we hope you are in this case.
for once in my life, if ever I were to have a dream come true, I would like for it to be that one.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the biggest tragedies of this case is that, it's not like they wrongfully convicted some guy that was just a piece of shit, like some murderer, rapist, like got away with all this stuff and they finally got him on that one, and it turns out that one was a wrongful conviction. It's like, well, you kind of got what you deserved because all the other stuff you did. the person that was wrongfully convicted in this case is literally one of the nicest, most genuine, authentic people that you could ever meet in your entire life. And that, to me, is, one of the biggest tragedies and one of the biggest wastes, because he had has so many talents, and could really make a difference in this world, and could really have a voice to help so many people. And just his heart and everything is, he wants to help people. Even we were talking the other day, when he gets out, he wants to help. He wants to go volunteer with that Equus, and this organization that helps disabled kids through animals and stuff. He's just such a good-hearted person.
Yeah, I think another thing, when we're talking about the origins of how we got to this point, really key development was when the Innocence Project of Texas agreed to get involved with it, because, again, going back to that first production team out of Pennsylvania to talk to us, if you could get somebody like the Innocence Project involved, that gives it a lot more cachet. That's going to move the ball down the field more. So a big shout out to them. And I know, I don't think I'm sharing anything out of school here, that they have a couple things that they'd like to do that are going to be expensive. Mm-hmm. And Scott and I have even talked to them about the potential that, listen, there are people out there that will help raise money for whatever you guys need to do. But Mike Ware and Allison Clayton and the people that are involved in the Innocence Project, that's a big part of getting Brandon's story to this national audience. And Allison Clayton will be interviewed for the 2020 piece that airs tonight.
She did an interview for them. And but yes, that was a huge thing, because, and really, when we first talked to Mike Ware about this, and just had a, 20 or 30 minute conversation with him, like, all the stuff that we were telling him, he's just like, you got to be kidding. You got to be kidding. You got to be kidding. And we're like, no, we're not kidding. And then so they eventually took a deep dive into the case and realized, yeah, this guy is more than likely innocent, and we really need to fight to get him out. So, and then since then, I think, Mike came to to one of our screenings and saw the film, and, really started kind of realizing a bunch of facts about the case that just disturbed him.
I think that was a turning point, too, because the last screening we had, Mike Ware agreed to come to it, watch the film, and then sit in with the Q&A that Scott and I have done after previous screenings. And the Q&A, as Scott said before, runs an hour and a half, and generally we have to finally say, okay, it's getting late, we got to cut this off.
Right.
But Mike Ware got up there. He'd seen the film for the first time. He'd seen the evidence, obviously, before that, a lot of it, but he'd seen the film for the first time. He gets up on stage and not only answered questions, but answered questions for the full hour and a half that we were up there. And the first words out of his mouth was, "That was an excellent film."
Wow, yeah.
And which, again, I in the way he said it and his attitude after that, it was like, yeah, I've been really sold on this case, but now I'm really sold on this case.
Right. And yeah, the Innocence Project, that of Texas, that is definitely a huge step. But we believe that this national exposure that ABC is going to be doing, I was talking with Brandon the other day, and I was like, I'm kind of excited, but kind of apprehensive in the attention that this case is going to be getting. What's going to happen? Are we going to be then contacted by every outlet out there, and we have to kind of juggle what we're going to do? Or is it going to be one of those things where, it's in the national spotlight for a day, and the next day there's a bigger news story? So we're kind of, cautiously optimistic that we get this case into the national discussion as it deserves to be, because, one of the things that and you touched upon this earlier, the LGBTQ community needs to understand that this can happen to them. This is not a far-fetched thing. This is something that can happen to any of these people that are in this process of coming out, not sure who they are, don't know who they want to tell. They're not telling the church friends and the school friends, but they are telling, the club friends and the people that they're going out to. So if the prosecutors in this case can paint that double life and convict somebody of capital murder on no evidence other than this character assassination and talking about this double life, then it can happen to them. And
Well, and I come at this from a different perspective, as you know, as a devoted follower of Jesus Christ. And I think that beyond that community, the wider community needs to take up this case. And I hope it does. I hope it doesn't just flash in the pan and go away. But about every 6 weeks, I do a podcast with a group out of Southern California called Raising Expectations. And they were great. And we generally talk about mission and ministry work that I do around the world and that my wife and I do. But in this case, I had asked them, I said, but we talk about my filmmaking career, my struggling actor stuff and commercials and whatever. And I have been mentioning this documentary that I'm working on several times. So when they asked me to be on Monday night, I said, well, give me 5 minutes at the end. I want to play the ABC promo and talk about the documentary. And it was very well received by this panel of people on there. It's like, I think it's become part of the public consciousness that wrongful convictions are not that rare. They're just too many of them. And I'm hoping that, anybody who believes in rights and fairness and just good versus evil, you don't want a young man, he's still a young man, spending half of his life in prison or jail for something he didn't do. Right. So I'm hoping it becomes part of a much wider conversation, but certainly for, as you say, people who are in the same position that could be accused of, well, you can lie about being gay, you can lie about whatever crime we've tried to convince a jury you're guilty of.
Right. And one of the things for me is I hate using that term double life, because to me, a double life is like a guy that has a family in Orlando and a family in Dallas.
Or Batman.
Or Batman. That is a double life. Somebody that is just struggling with who they are, struggling with coming out, and just keeping, we all keep parts of our lives secret from other people. Not everybody knows that I'm a superhero at night and fly around and, but anyways,
how hard it is to live with that secret, Scott.
Now it's been exposed. But we all have things that we don't put out to the general public. And if somebody is in the process of that, kind of not only, and for Brandon, it wasn't like he knew at that point that he was completely gay. He was trying to figure out, do I like girls? Do I like guys? Do I like both? Do I like, so he's going through this internal struggle. And as he puts it is, it's nobody else's business who I love or whatever. So I didn't feel like I had to, walk around with a big rainbow flag and wave it around. So, that's the thing that scares me the most is that, you can go through this completely normal process. But yes, I agree that, it needs to be exposed how they convicted this guy on literally no proof whatsoever. They have some circumstantial evidence that a lot of it turned out to be lies and stuff like that, but they definitely didn't have any proof. And how do you convict somebody of capital murder with proof beyond a reasonable doubt when there is no proof? And, to me, proof is he's on the videotape and you see him shooting the guy. Like, that's proof. Or, in a rape case where they do a rape kit and the guy's DNA is on there. Like, that's proof. Somebody says that he threw cats off of an overpass. That's not proof. That's just like innuendo and speculation and hearsay. And, it's like, how in the hell does he even get arrested, let alone convicted in this case? And I think that's part of our mutual frustration is that arrest warrant. When we talk about
that arrest warrant is, it's just mind-boggling. There's nothing in the arrest warrant that puts him at the scene of the crime. There's not a shred of evidence in the arrest warrant. And I guess the guy that signed it is now selling houses or something. But how that happened?
Yeah, as well he should be. He should not be a judge
it's disgusting.
Anymore.
It's disgusting. I think I know who you're talking about too. But it just that arrest warrant is disgusting. I mean, if he could get arrested on so much hearsay, then I should have been in jail 10 times over.
Right.
You know, and the other night, when you first sent me the 2020 promo that they've been playing on television, it made me really sad because the last time I saw Brandon with my own eyes was possibly 2009, and here it is 2022, and that was the first modern footage I've seen of him other than in your film.
Right.
He's a man now. He's a grown man now. And when I saw him last, he was still that kid, still trying to figure himself out. That kid that was in a bad situation.
Right.
And I've been trying to come to grips with this in my own life recently. This whole aging thing, this whole getting older thing. You know,
I don't know what you're talking about.
You know, my children are all adults and they're all having children and they don't need me in their life anymore. And you know, hooray for them, lucky. But just my residual image, I guess, of Brandon and how I view Brandon in my head when I think of him is still that kid that I saw with my own eyes and spoke to in 2009.
I've just had the occasional conversation with Brandon when he calls Scott while we're driving somewhere. So, Scott, tell me, how's Brandon? Is he nervous? Is he upset? You talk to him pretty regularly. How's he handling this whole pending ABC 2020 thing?
Well, I mean, he's nervous as the rest of us are. You know, it's because there's been shows done. You know, Discovery did a show about the case that took the angle that he was guilty, and you know, and ignored a lot of the evidence. Obviously, never really checked a lot of the evidence that they were told by law enforcement. So I think that, you know, he's nervous, Edie's nervous, his grandma's nervous, I'm nervous, everybody's nervous about how it's going to play out. And, you know, one of the, and I'll put links to the 2020 trailers in the description of this podcast, but one of the trailers is his grandmother. And Bonnie describes, you know, how she heard about her son dying, and just it was like this when I interviewed her. Like, I just felt so bad for this woman that had this happen to her son. You know, it wasn't like he died in a car wreck or had a heart attack or, you know, something like that. You know, I can't imagine what it would be like to have a child brutally murdered. And, you know, that I just feel so bad for her and having to go through this, and then to lose her grandkid that she believes, and we all here believe, is 100% innocent. Like, that just, I mean, talk about tragedy after tragedy. And even she says in the promo that, you know, she was really depressed for a while, but she just kind of had to learn to live with it. And she should never have to had learned to live with that.
Yeah, and Dennis and Norma, too. I know we talk about Brandon a lot. Because Brandon is the true victim of all of this. But Dennis and Norma deserve this too. The memory of Dennis and Norma deserve this type of exposure. The family members who are still just affected daily by this horror, they deserve this exposure. And whatever comes of this, 100%.
And I've said this before, and I haven't said it a lot, so I'll repeat it. But you know, when I first went out to visit the crime scene, when I first started doing this film, I went out there to do some B-roll and stuff like that. And I sat in my car, and I'd never heard voices in my head before, but I literally heard somebody say, Scott. And I was like, I kind of, you know, like surprised, like, who? I'm in my car alone. Like, what was that? I kind of turned around and nobody was there. And that was all that I heard physically, but I knew that it was Dennis and Norma. And I had a conversation in my head and a little bit out loud, telling them that I was not going to rest until justice was brought to their murder. And, you know, and I haven't. And it's one of those things where, you know, I told him, I said, not only am I going to get justice for you, but I'm going to get justice for your son. And, and it's been that promise really that's been driving me since
Well,
2017.
you're amazing. Okay, you know this case inside and out. That was one of the most impressive things about you when I met you, is you are a walking case file for this case. You're amazing. Your dedication amazes me. Your love for these people who you didn't even know until this. It's just astonishing that somebody can have a dedication and a love this deep. And then when Richard got involved, I remember my wife and I were taking a walk down the Katy Trail. It was a beautiful day, and I got a call from you, and I'm like, oh God, here it is. Here's Scott. He's going to put me to work. And you told me that Richard decided to get involved with this, and I'm like, that's great. The guy with the hair, that's awesome. Just between your knowledge, your drive, your connections, your drive, me as the comedy relief to keep you both going. Because I'm just a guy. I don't know this case inside and out like you, and I don't have a history in this business like you. What I do have is I'm very motivated, and I have been my entire life. It's been a downfall for most of my life. I hate it when good people have to take the fall for bad things, and when bad people get away with bad things. I hate it. That is my drive. I can't stand it. And that the more that I read, the more I spoke to you, the more I recalled, the more that the people around me, when they were helping me in the very beginning of all this, were getting bullied. And just the more whispers, the more strange cars, the more I decided that this is something I'm supposed to be doing as well. I'm supposed to be the annoying guy with the finger, just doing this, just making the eccentric Facebook posts, just saying the things that I say on the podcast that I know has people just shaking their head. But that's fine. If I'm the shake your head guy, that's fine. And I know you don't hear this enough, because I don't know if anyone tells you. I'm sure there are people that tell you, but I don't know if you hear it enough. Just you, Scott Poggensee, you are an anomaly, sir. You to do this. You're not related to these people. There's no blood there. There's nothing that ties you to this case or this family or these people. Yet here you are. For all these years now, just day in and day out, you breathe this case because you want justice to finally be served, and you want an innocent man to walk free. Right. And just thank you.
Well,
I would second that. You're impressive, and your dedication has been impressive.
Well, I appreciate that very much. To me, when I discovered that Brandon was innocent, because, and people that have listened to the podcast, the story. I wrote Brandon, and it took him a year to write me back, but he was like, yes. I told him, I want to hear it from your lips, because as similarly to Chad, when I first saw that mugshot on TV, I was like, that does not look like a killer. That does not look like someone. So that's what kind of intrigued me to begin with. And then after he was convicted, I wrote him. And he wrote back and he said, yes, I am innocent, but you don't even have to take my word for it. Just look at the evidence. And then I got the evidence, and every page that I turned, I was like, well, maybe the next page will tell me why they arrested him and why they convicted him. And maybe the next page will tell me, and maybe the next page. And it just got to the point where I got done with the file, and I was like, wait a second, there is nothing here that says that he committed this crime. There's a lot of statements from ex-friends, and there's a lot of lies and all this stuff, but there's nothing that shows or proves that he did this crime. So it just really, the more I started, and then, we started writing back and forth, and once I realized that this kid was 100% innocent, I just felt like it was just something I had to do. I didn't even have an option. And then, that conversation with Dennis and Norma, that definitely sealed the deal. But, it's funny that you mentioned, Chad, something about that you hate it when people that are innocent or whatever and have to take the fall for somebody else. You know, one of the upcoming episodes on season 3 is a guy named William Dillon, and he was in prison. I forget, it was like 28 years or something like that. And he got out and he started writing songs and stuff like that. Well, he has a song called Black Robes and Lawyers. And in that song, all these songs he wrote in prison. And one of the lines in there that when I was listening to it just caught me off guard, and I was like, it actually made me pretty emotional, was the line is that they did and it was just like, whoa, like that is crazy. That, you know, like it's just, he's such a talented writer, talented singer. But we will feature his episode coming up, I think, in about 3 or 4 weeks, and we'll play a lot of his music, and they'll be able to hear that. But yeah, that song in particular, when he said, you know, I was listening to it and he was singing it, and you could just see in his face, you know, they did the crime and I had to do the time, and it was just so sad that all of these are out here. But I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of the American Justice Podcast, our special episode. I want to thank Richard Ray for being here and being involved in the case and making all of the introductions that you've been able to make and get us, you know, a lot further along than we were at that point. And so your continued involvement in this is very, very, very much appreciated.
I'm like you. I'm in this until we get the kid out.
Yep. That'll be a great day and a huge party when we get him out. And I keep telling everybody that, you know, that's involved in this and that we interview and stuff like that are on Brandon's side. I say, you know, you'll be invited to the party because we will have we'll probably rent out a ballroom or something and, you know, have a huge party when he gets out. So, but he deserves it. And I think the first thing is we'll probably take him to a steakhouse. After to eat prison food for 17 years, or hopefully only 17 years. But anyways, thank you guys very much for joining us. Please go back and check out the first season if you want to know about it. And the episode of 2020 on ABC airs tonight, if you're listening to it today. If you're listening to it on Friday. I mean, I guess they're always listening to it today, right? Whatever day they're listening. But if you're listening on Friday, May 20th, it airs at 9 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central. And if you're listening to this after May 20th, I'm sure that you can find it streaming online, Hulu, or any of those.
I believe it will be. You'll be able to stream it live on Hulu if I read that correctly.
Okay, so if anybody has Hulu but they don't have network television. So that's a way to look at it. They also, I think they keep old episodes on abc.com /2020, I think it is. But you can go back and watch old episodes there as well. But yeah, if you're interested in this case, definitely, do your own research and hear all of the evidence and make up your own opinion. And
maybe we should have a post-ABC 2020 podcast to talk about after we've seen it.
Yeah, that's true because, like I was saying that, sometimes they'll present stuff that has an explanation, but they don't explain what it was, and I think one of the biggest instances of that is probably the bag that, Brandon had an overnight bag that he had on in the truck when they were driving back that Sunday night to the club and driving back to Alex's house. And Alex and James started going through the bag, and Brandon kind of freaked out. He was like, "No, don't go through that bag. It's my personal stuff." I mean, I'm almost got to the point where he stopped the truck and was like, "Stop it," And so both Alex and James both said, that they felt that it was kind of weird that he was doing that. But, it comes to find out that he had gay porn in there. And, the other friend that he had with him, Robert, was a school friend at ACU, Abilene Christian. And if that would have been seen or exposed, then, if Robert told anybody, he would have been kicked out of school. So, there's a reason for this stuff because it looks really bad. Like, oh, Brandon was, freaking out. They were looking through his bag and, must have been the murder weapons in there. And then you realize, well, wait a second, not only is there an explanation for it, but they got that bag and they did DNA tests on it twice and they couldn't find anything. So it's just impossible to believe that there'd be a bloody knife and a bloody gun inside of this bag, and then, no DNA whatsoever. So that's just one of those things that, I agree with you. We should have a post ABC airing podcast just so we can talk about any of the stuff that wasn't addressed in the show. But all right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for there. And just remember, everybody, to stay strong, stay aware, and get involved. We'll see you next time.
The American Justice Podcast is owned and copyrighted by Atua Productions, LLC of Dallas, Texas. Your hosts are Scott Poggensee and C. Derick Miller. Atua Productions aims for this to be an interactive podcast where you, the audience, has a great amount of influence on the content of our shows. You can interact with us in several ways. First, and most preferred, is you can leave us a voicemail. Our phone number is 972-942-0444. Be sure to leave your name and city you're calling from, along with whether or not we can use your voice on the air. If Facebook is more your style, you can log on to our Facebook page at facebook.com/American Justice Podcast. Feel free to leave a comment, or you can message us on Messenger if you have a more pressing question or issue. If you'd like to blog about the show, you can log on to AmericanJusticePodcast.com and let us know what you think there. If you're a tweeter, you can also voice your opinion on Twitter at @AJusticePodcast. We would very much appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review on all the podcast streaming platforms.